The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the dry trail as Caleb guided his wagon toward home. The wind was still, the only sound the creaking of old wood and the soft clop of his horse's hooves. After 3 days in town and a week of hauling supplies, he was eager to rest, but something stopped him cold. A sound, faint, almost imagined. He pulled the reins, and the wagon slowed to a halt. There it was again, a soft, high-pitched whimper. At first he thought it might be a coyote pup in the brush, but it was too rhythmic. Too human. Frowning, he climbed into the back of the wagon, pushing aside sacks of flour and tins of coffee. Then, under a worn blanket bundled in the far corner, he saw her. A woman, young, pale as linen, with a smear of dried blood across her temple. She was curled protectively around 2 small, swaddled infants, their faces barely visible beneath the blanket folds. One of them stirred, then let out a thin cry. Caleb froze. He was no stranger to the hard edges of life, but this was something else. A mother and babies, hidden in the back of his wagon like frightened mice. How long had they been there? He reached out slowly, unsure if she was even alive. Her eyes fluttered open, barely. Bloodshot, weary, and full of terror. She tried to sit up but winced in pain, tightening her arms around the children as if to shield them. "Please," she whispered, voice hoarse and cracked. "Don't take them." Her words stabbed through him like a blade. He raised his hands in surrender, his voice low and steady. "You're safe, ma'am. I ain't here to hurt you." She blinked at him, breathing hard, and her head fell back against the canvas floor. One baby, barely older than a few months, began to cry again, a thin, wailing sob that echoed across the empty plain. Caleb knew what he had to do. He gently gathered the blanket tighter around them and lifted all 3, woman and babies, into his arms. She barely reacted, her body limp, her mind slipping back into unconsciousness. He glanced around the deserted trail. No wagons, no signs of pursuit, just wind, dust, and silence. "Hang on," he murmured. "We'll get you somewhere warm." He climbed back to the seat, gave the reins a flick, and set off toward the hills, toward his homestead, his heart pounding with questions he couldn't yet ask, and a fierce protectiveness he didn't yet understand. The morning after bringing her home, Caleb found the woman feverish and barely coherent. He'd laid her gently on the cot near the hearth, wrapped her in blankets, and kept the fire going through the night. The babies, still unnamed to him, had woken every few hours crying from hunger or discomfort. He'd done what he could, warmed milk, changed what rags passed for diapers, and held them until they slept again. She didn't speak much the first 2 days. Her lips were dry, cracked. Caleb coaxed water into her slowly, then broth, and finally something more filling. The cut on her head scabbed over, but bruises on her arms and collarbone told a story she hadn't voiced yet. He didn't push. He wasn't a man who believed in pressing people before they were ready. So he waited, tending to the little ones as best he could, changing his routines to keep the cabin quiet, warm, and calm. He built a cradle out of old wood, lined it with flannel, and rocked the twins one at a time when they fussed. On the 4th day, she finally looked him in the eyes. "You should have left us," she said quietly. Caleb set down the small block of firewood he was chopping near the hearth. "Didn't seem right," he replied. She looked away, her fingers tracing the blanket's edge. "You don't know what kind of trouble you've brought on yourself." He sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "What kinds?" "That." She hesitated, then whispered, "The kind that doesn't forget." There was silence. Only the pop of the fire and a soft baby sigh from the cradle filled the space between them. "My name's Ella," she said finally. "Those are Josie and James." Caleb gave a slow nod. "I'm Caleb, just Caleb." She watched him a moment longer, then said, "Their father is dead. He died before they were born. I was with someone else after. A mistake. I tried to leave. He didn't take it well." "Is that who did this to you?" Ella's jaw tensed. "He doesn't see us as people. Just something he can own." Her voice caught, and she looked down, blinking quickly. Caleb didn't offer pity. Instead, he stood and moved to the stove, ladled soup into a bowl, and set it beside her. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But you don't have to run anymore either. Not while you're under my roof." Ella stared at the bowl for a moment, her lip trembling. Then she picked up the spoon with a shaking hand and took a bite. Later, he found her sitting by the fire, Josie in her lap and James nestled in a bundle beside her. She was humming to them softly, something wordless and worn. He leaned against the doorframe and watched without speaking. The woman who had arrived broken and afraid was still fragile, but something in her posture had changed, just slightly. Like a tree beginning to straighten after a storm. She didn't know it yet, but she had started to root herself in this place. And for the first time in years, Caleb didn't mind the sound of a lullaby in his home. The storm rolled in just after sundown, thick clouds pressing low over the hills and a chill wind whistling through the trees. Rain lashed against the windows, turning the dirt yard into mud. Caleb had just finished securing the barn doors when he saw it, a lantern bobbing in the distance, cutting through the darkness like a slow, hunting eye. He stiffened, one hand going instinctively to the rifle propped just inside the cabin door. The figure came closer, the outline of a man astride a tall black horse emerging from the storm. The coat was expensive, dark wool, heavy and clean despite the weather. The horse was purebred, its hooves sharp against the soaked earth. Whoever he was, he didn't belong out here. The man dismounted with practiced ease and marched up the path like he owned the land. Caleb stood waiting, arms crossed. Looking for something, he asked flatly. The man's lip curled. I'm looking for someone, actually. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice used to giving orders and expecting obedience. She's here, isn't she? Behind Caleb, the door creaked open. Ella stepped into the light, holding both babies, one on each hip. Her face was pale, but she stood tall. Reginald. The man's eyes lit up. There you are, he said, as if greeting a lost dog. You had me chasing ghosts for days. Do you have any idea the trouble you've caused? I told you we were done, she said, voice low but steady. You don't get to follow me. Oh, I do, Ella, Reginald sneered. You're mine, and so are they. You've been playing house out here long enough. Caleb stepped forward. You need to leave. Reginald's eyes flicked toward him with disdain. And who are you? Her savior. You think you know what you're protecting? She's nothing without the name I gave her. You think she told you everything? She didn't have to, Caleb said, voice calm but cold. I saw what you did to her. That's all I need to know. Reginald's temper flared. You're harboring a woman and children that belong to me. I can have you arrested. Hell, I can have you shot for theft. Ella stepped closer to Caleb. We're not property, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. Reginald reached under his coat. The glint of a pistol appeared in his hand. Caleb didn't hesitate. His own rifle was already resting against the wall behind him, and he moved faster than Reginald expected. In one fluid motion, he lifted the weapon and leveled it at the man's chest. Don't, Caleb said, just one word, calm, deadly. For a moment, Reginald hesitated. His finger twitched. Then, behind them, a shout rang out. Drop it, car. Sheriff Daniels stepped into view from the trees, soaked to the bone, his own weapon drawn. Two deputies flanked him, rifles at the ready. Reginald turned slowly, jaw clenching. What the hell is this? You've been a wanted man for weeks, Daniels said, stepping closer. Assault, false imprisonment, threats against a woman under the protection of this county. I'm her fiancé, Reginald snapped. You were, Daniels said. Now you're just a criminal. As the sheriff slapped irons on him and read him his rights, Reginald looked back once more at Ella, his eyes burning with fury. This isn't over, he hissed. Ella didn't flinch. She held her babies tighter and replied with quiet certainty. Yes, it is. The lawman led Reginald away through the storm, his shouts fading into the wind. Caleb shut the door slowly behind them. Inside, the cabin was still. Ella's breath shuddered, then steadied. For the first time in a long while, she believed she was finally safe. Spring came slowly to the valley, as if the land itself needed time to thaw from the long, bitter winter. Snow melted into soft earth, and wildflowers began to bloom along the creekbed that ran behind Caleb's homestead. Birds returned, filling the trees with song, and the cabin that had once stood quiet and lonely now pulsed with life. Inside, laughter echoed, small, bright giggles from Josie and James as they tottered across the wooden floor, their bare feet pattering like rainfall. Ella knelt nearby, arms outstretched, cheering them on as they took uncertain steps between her and Caleb. Their faces lit up when they reached his knees, and he scooped them into his arms with a grin. Fast as wild ponies, he said, settling one on each hip. They get it from me, Ella teased, brushing a loose curl behind her ear as she stood. The bruises were long gone. Her skin had regained its color, her posture straighter now, her eyes no longer darting toward the door at every sound. She smiled more often, laughed easily. Her hands, once tentative and guarded, now moved with purpose, carrying, sewing, cooking, planting. Caleb had built a new room onto the cabin, hammering and sawing through wind and cold. It was simple but strong, with space enough for 2 cribs, shelves filled with books and toys, and a window that caught the morning light just right. Ella had stitched the curtains herself, pale blue, dotted with clouds. She hung them the same day they moved the twins into their own beds. They hadn't talked much about the night Reginald was arrested. The sheriff had sent word that he'd been convicted and sentenced, likely to spend the better part of a decade behind bars. Ella said little when the letter came, only held it in her hands for a long time before feeding it to the stove. Some things, she said, didn't deserve to stay. Caleb had nodded, understanding in his quiet way. One morning, as he came in from the fields with a basket of early greens, he found Ella standing on the porch, one child on each side of her. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue, and the hills beyond their land shimmered in the sun. She turned to him, shading her eyes. You know, she said, I used to think rescue only happened in stories. He set the basket down, walked up the steps, and gently touched her arm. Sometimes stories are just truths that took the long way around. She looked at him. Then, really looked. Months of hardship had tested them both, reshaped them into something more than survivors. There was strength in her eyes, yes, but also something softer. Something like peace. Josie tugged on Caleb's pant leg. "Papa," she said, a little uncertain. He froze. Ella's eyes widened. Caleb crouched, scooping her up. "What did you say, sweet pea?" "Papa," she repeated, more confident now. James echoed her, giggling. Ella's hands flew to her mouth, and she laughed, choked by something too big for words. Caleb looked up at her, his heart fuller than it had ever been. He stood, still holding Josie, and reached out his free hand to her. She took it. The valley stretched out before them, full of green and promise. And behind them, the old life faded like snow under the spring sun. They had no need for fancy vows or grand declarations. The truth of their love was in every small act, every meal shared, every night spent rocking a child, every morning begun with a quiet, "Good day." They had been broken, but they had found each other. And now, together, they were whole.